Welcome to Inside the Mask, the podcast where we cover off all your favorite horror movies with a true crime twist. Today, we're packing our sleeping bags and hitting the road to cover the first installment of my all-time personal favorite horror franchise. It's the story of a group of camp counselors who, in the midst of renovating a local summer camp for a grand reopening, find themselves caught up in a violent series of murders. And while their desperate isolation at Camp Crystal Lake is well documented, the motives of the killer in question predate this specific massacre and instead began over 20 years prior. I'm your host, Evan Taggart, and this is Friday the 13th. It's Saturday, June 14th, 1979, and in the small cottage country town of Crystal Lake, New Jersey, police respond to a welfare check at a local summer camp in the area. Now, telephone communications to this camp have seemingly been cut off entirely, and while an overnight heavy rainfall and thunderstorm is considered the most likely culprit, as it turns out, this theory by police could not be farther from the truth. What officers would find at Crystal Lake, coupled with the testimony provided by the only surviving victim, can only be described as horrifying. Now, this establishment, identified in reports as Camp Crystal Lake, was first founded in 1935 by local owner and operators, the Christie family. Known to operate in the summer months on the picturesque lakefront in question, the camp was a prosperous venture for many years, offering an escape for kids in the summertime, as well as ample employment opportunities for students within the local community. Well, that is until 1957, when Camp Crystal Lake would suffer the first of many tragedies to come. It was during the summer of 1957 that the camp would record a tragic on-site fatality. In what was deemed an unfortunate accident, an attending 11-year-old boy, named in reports as Jason Voorhees, was reportedly swimming in Crystal Lake unsupervised by the counselors employed on site. Now, the first to report Jason missing was his own mother, Pamela Voorhees, the resident cook at the camp, and despite a combined exhaustive search effort from both police and volunteers, Jason's body was actually never recovered. He was assumed dead by responders, a victim of an otherwise innocent case of accidental drowning. Now, at this point, out of both respect for the no doubt tragic situation and to the ongoing police investigation, Camp Crystal Lake was closed early for the summer, and it remained that way for a full calendar year. But the tragedy would continue the following summer when in 1958, two camp counselors identified in reports as Barry and Claudette were discovered dead on the grounds. Witnesses interviewed by police indicate that at some point during an evening social gathering, the pair had seemingly wandered away from the main cabins. Their bodies were later discovered by concerned parties at Camp Crystal Lake, counselors who had searched the grounds, when the victims in question didn't return later that evening. Now, it's clear to police at this point that Barry and Claudette were victims of murder. The remains were found on the top floor of a barn structure on site, where both victims had been stabbed to death. And despite the obvious foul play here and numerous interviews with witnesses on staff at Camp Crystal Lake, police could not name a suspect in their investigation, and the murders of counselors Barry and Claudette would remain an unsolved cold case for nearly 20 years. The summer camp itself was eventually closed indefinitely after numerous attempts to reopen over the years were met with no doubt strange happenings. On-site fires set by an unknown arsonist, and the alleged poisoning of the camp's well water supply, just to name a few. And ultimately it's here that the Christie family decided to close the doors of Camp Crystal Lake for good. Well, that is, until June 1979, when the controversial decision to once again reopen to the public would kick off a violent series of murders, culminating in the deaths of almost the entire staff on site, and igniting a chain reaction of seemingly endless gruesome killings that would haunt the Crystal Lake community for years to come. Now, while police would first discover the new victims of the Crystal Lake killer on the 14th of June, the actual murders are estimated to have taken place merely one day prior, on Friday the 13th, 1979. It's on this day that preparations were well underway for the controversial grand reopening of the once popular summer camp. commissioned by the surviving heir of the Christie family and then owner of the grounds, Steve Christie. Now, Steve had hired a group of roughly 8 to 10 counselors to assist in renovating the camp just in time to open for the summer season, where a reported total of nearly 50 kids were scheduled to attend in the months to follow. These counselors and on-site staff, many of whom would be murder victims in the case, were mostly students, just simply working through summer break. The first of these victims in the case is often considered to be that of Annie Phillips, a female camp counselor who was hitchhiking to Camp Crystal Lake from out of state. While her body was found on the grounds at the camp, specifically in that of the killer's vehicle that was parked on site, it's believed by police that Annie was actually killed at some point during her journey to the campgrounds, rather than alongside the other counselors and victims in the case. Witness statements provided to police suggest that Annie had been seen in town the day of her murder and had even hitched a ride with a local truck driver in a vehicle registered to the nearby Elston Oil Supply in New Jersey. Now, when this driver was questioned by police, he stated that he dropped off Annie at an intersection near Morgan Cemetery just outside of town, where Annie then proceeded on foot towards her destination at Camp Crystal Lake, hoping to hitch another ride along the way. Now, it would be the last time that anyone saw Annie Phillips alive. It's believed that Annie was picked up by the Crystal Lake killer, as the murderer herself actually traveled to the campgrounds to commit the other murders in the case. Annie's body was discovered in the front seat of a green Jeep that was registered to the murderer in question, having been killed in an MO that would be shared across numerous victims in the case. A single slash to the throat from a sharp weapon, later determined to have been a hunting knife. Now, due to the close proximity of the other victims in the case and the fact that the murders in question were carried out all over the same day on Friday the 13th, it's pretty difficult for investigators to determine the order of which the victims were actually killed. Now, that being said, some speculation can actually be eliminated as the result of impact statements provided to police by the sole survivor of the events, a female camp counselor named Alice Hardy. Now, like others in the case, Alice was hired as a counselor at Camp Crystal Lake for the summer duration. Based on her official police statement, it would appear that the first victims on site were likely fellow counselors Ned Rubenstein and Jack Burrell. Both of these male victims were located by authorities in the same cabin on the grounds, a location heavily theorized to have been used by the Crystal Lake killer to conceal her own whereabouts during the murders. The victims' bodies were discovered in a bunk bed inside the cabin, Ned Rubenstein on the top bunk and Jack Burrell on the bottom. Ned was found to have had his throat slit in a similar fashion as prior victim Annie Phillips, and autopsy determined that he likely bled out or succumbed to shock shortly thereafter sustaining his injury. Now, Jack Burrell was also killed by a wound to the throat, albeit in an entirely different fashion. A single arrow, commonly kept on the campgrounds to be used in archery activities, was determined to have passed through the mattress beneath Jack's body and through the back of his neck, where it then exited the front of his throat and severed a major artery along the way. Now, Jack died from massive blood loss as the result of this wound, and it's theorized by police that the Crystal Lake killer had likely been concealing themselves underneath the bed for an undisclosed amount of time prior to the murder. Now, due to the fact that Alice Hardy reports that she was playing a board game with fellow counselors and future victims Bill Brown and Brenda Jones for the majority of the evening leading up to their own eventual deaths, and also given the supporting evidence that victim Steve Christie had been visiting a diner in town that evening, it's likely that the next victim of the Crystal Lake killer was that of female counselor Marcy Standler. Marcy was discovered dead in the bathroom facility on the grounds, where she suffered a massive trauma wound to the base of her skull, fracturing the bone and fatally damaging her brain. Autopsy here reports the wound to be consistent with that of a blow from an axe, which is also supported by police findings, wherein an axe with blood samples matching Marcy's DNA was later recovered from an adjacent cabin as evidence. Now, as mentioned previously, victim Steve Christie had been seen at the local Blairstown diner in town at Crystal Lake, where purchase receipts indicate that he did pay in cash for a coffee at some point during the evening and interacted with various patrons in the premises. Later police reports also showcase that a Crystal Lake police officer had come across Steve Christie on the outskirts of town, seemingly having suffered a broken down vehicle on the side of the road. Now at this point, a severe thunderstorm had blanketed the entire area in an intense rainfall, and as such, police notes show that Steve Christie hitched a ride with this officer in question, all the way back to the road entering Camp Crystal Lake. At some point between dropping the victim off at this back road, which according to the officer's own statement was due to reports of a severe vehicular crash nearby, it's believed that Steve Christie was murdered and then staged in an elaborate fashion on the grounds of Camp Crystal Lake itself. His body was ultimately found by investigators hanging upside down on the grounds of the campsite, having been killed by a fatal stab wound to the lower torso. Now, the weapon in question, a large Bowie-style knife, was recovered still lodged in the victim's body. Now, it's theorized by police, though not actually confirmed, that the Crystal Lake killer might have actually at some point sabotaged Steve Christie's vehicle, as other vehicles that were located on the grounds that were owned and registered to the various other counselors employed there were found to have been rendered inoperable by unlawful tampering. Now, the most likely theory here is that the killer was attempting to remove all options of escape for her victims, ensuring their complete isolation at the camp with nowhere to run. The final two victims in the 1979 Crystal Lake murders were that of counselors Bill Brown and Brenda Jones. Now, as mentioned earlier, during the majority of the murders taking place on the grounds on Friday the 13th, Bill Brown and Brenda Jones were attending the main counselor's cabin, along with Alice Hardy. Alice reported to police that as the severe rain and thunderstorm started to set in, Brenda had at some point excused herself back to her own cabin for the remainder of the evening, while Bill Brown departed to the nearby generator room after an apparent power outage struck the campsite. Bill's body would first be discovered by Alice herself, who reportedly ventured out into the storm when Bill failed to return. His death would be arguably the most violent in the 1979 murders, where it's determined that he was not only killed via slash to the throat, but he was also horrifically pinned to the back of an exterior door with what was found to be a series of archery arrows to his body. Now, crime scene photos showcase that two of these arrows entered into his torso and one into his upper thigh, and the final arrow that quite horrifically passed through his left eye socket. It's assumed by police here that due to the injuries sustained to Bill's throat, which was once again the same as the other victims in the case, that the Crystal Lake killer likely used the same MO in Bill's death, first slitting his throat and then for unknown reasons staging his body, gruesomely pinning it to the door like some kind of a macabre decoration. Now at this point, officially made aware that murders are taking place on site here, Alice Hardy fled back to the main counselor cabin to reportedly barricade herself within, hoping to potentially ride out the storm until help or maybe even police arrived. Now these plans, however, would change dramatically when the body of victim Brenda Jones was allegedly thrown through a window of the cabin. Now, Brenda's cause of death was ultimately unclear in autopsy, but it's noted in coroner reports that she suffered massive internal and external trauma, possibly an attack by a blunt force object of some kind, or as indicated by numerous puncture wounds, a further attack with a sharp object. Now, it's suggested by police here that this elaborate act of throwing the body through the window was likely performed by the Crystal Lake killer in an effort to almost lure Alice out from her hiding spot inside, where she had hoped to claim her final victim in the case here. But when this plan doesn't work, the murderer would have to try a new tactic, bringing surviving victim Alice Hardy face to face with the Crystal Lake killer herself. In a dramatic final confrontation that must have been truly terrifying for the surviving Alice, the Crystal Lake killer revealed herself as none other than Pamela Voorhees, the prior on-site cook at Camp Crystal Lake in 1958. And Alice's own statements to authorities here highlight the truly unstable mental state of the serial killer, and just how far Pamela herself had descended into apparent psychosis. Alice later told police that during a violent and physical altercation with the killer that would span various areas of the grounds, Pamela would often speak to herself or to someone who wasn't actually there, even going so far as to physically alter her own voice, as if it was two different individuals speaking to one another. And the person that Pamela believed she was talking to had a name, Jason, her own son, who had tragically drowned over 20 years ago. Psychologists believe that Pamela Voorhees had suffered a complete mental break at the death of her son Jason in 1957, possibly even causing an almost split personality type persona within Pamela's own mind, where she believed herself to be punishing those responsible for Jason's death. Upon the conclusion of the investigation into the 1979 murders, police also believed that Pamela Voorhees was the most likely culprit in the original killings at Camp Crystal Lake in 1958, that of then counselors Barry and Claudette. It's also theorized that Pamela might have been responsible for the various mishaps around the camp in the subsequent years to follow, and was likely done in an attempt to prevent the camp from reopening. And analysts go so far to say that it was the confirmed reopening of the camp in 1979 at the hands of Steve Christie that likely sent Pamela Voorhees completely over the edge, resulting in her killing spree on Friday the 13th. Well, her murderous rampage would claim one more life, and quite famously, it was that of the Crystal Lake killer herself. Now, when investigators arrive at the grisly crime scene on June 14th, they first discover an unresponsive Alice Hardy partially submerged in the lake itself. Now, initially, it was assumed that Alice might have been the victim of an accidental drowning herself, but upon retrieval of her person, first responders were able to successfully revive Alice, where she was subsequently taken to a nearby hospital for recovery. However, the next body police would discover on the beach at Camp Crystal Lake was not so fortunate. The headless remains of serial killer Pamela Voorhees were found laying in the sand, in what crime scene photos depict as a pool of her own blood. And in a mystery that was puzzling to investigators at the time, but would ultimately be solved in the years to come, Pamela's head was actually not recovered at the scene of the crime. Now, police believed that it was possible that the head had been picked over by local wildlife, as bears and the like were known to frequent the area, though the eventual truth as to the location of this severed head would prove to be far more disturbing. In her final statements provided to authorities, Alice Hardy claimed that during her altercation with Pamela Voorhees, she acted in what was deemed to be self-defense, ultimately using Pamela's own weaponized machete to fatally decapitate the murderer, killing her instantly. Upon the conclusion of the 1979 Camp Crystal Lake murders, police would attribute all of the deaths therein to Pamela Voorhees herself, fueled by a murderous rage over the revenge of her son's death so many years ago. Now, following the massacre, Camp Crystal Lake was promptly and permanently closed, deemed by authorities as a condemned and no trespass area that was punishable by law. But tragically, the story of surviving victim Alice Hardy would not end with the brutal events of 1979, when that same year, only a mere 2 months later, Alice would go missing from her home in Crystal Lake, New Jersey, and her assailant would turn out to be one of the most infamous serial killers of all time. None other than the previously presumed dead son of the Crystal Lake killer, Jason Voorhees. And for that story, be sure to tune in to our next episode as we dive headfirst into the full history of the prolific killer Jason Voorhees as he terrorized the surrounding area of Crystal Lake in the years to come, including the gruesome murders of over 35 reported victims and his own eventual and fittingly violent demise. Thanks for listening to our true crime spin on Friday the 13th. This franchise is my all-time favorite within the genre, and while the series is obviously more well-known for Jason's antics across a whopping 11 films, the first entry famously barely features Jason at all, and is instead all about Mama Voorhees getting some revenge on Camp Crystal Lake. I'll talk more about Jason's legacy in our follow-up episode, but viewing the original Friday the 13th as a standalone film, it's still a pretty strong horror entry in my opinion. The story and setting is interesting, there's a few red herrings sprinkled throughout, and most notably, the brief performance of Betsy Palmer as Pamela Voorhees is an obvious horror icon standout. Now, to stay kind of objective here, one can probably make a case for the reveal of the killer to be a bit anticlimactic, as Pamela herself literally doesn't even show up in a single scene until her reveal at the end of the movie. So really, if you're viewing this for the first time, you might be like, who is this person supposed to be? The entire buildup of her character arc and the reveal itself hinges entirely heavily on Betsy Palmer's own performance. Fortunately, she absolutely nails it though, just like she nailed Bill to the wall with those arrows. Man, that scene is horrifying. Friday the 13th was a massive hit, and interestingly, when the studio wanted to pursue a sequel focusing on the surviving Jason Voorhees, it actually seems like the majority that were involved in the films thought it was an absolutely ludicrous idea. Now, fortunately for all of us, they went ahead and did it anyway, creating one of the most prolific horror icons in the process. For that story and the conclusion of the Crystal Lake murders, be sure to tune in next week as we tackle the life and death of Jason Voorhees. As always, I'm your host, Evan Taggart, and this has been Inside the Mask.